Somewhere in the high desert of eastern California, at an elevation where the wind never really stops and snow can fall during any month of the year, there is a town that the state of California officially describes as being in a condition of arrested decay. Not restored, not preserved, arrested, as if the decay itself had been caught in the middle of something it wasn't supposed to be doing. And frozen there, mid-motion, still reaching, the town is called Bodie. And between 1877 and 1882, it was home to somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 people, depending on which census taker you believed. And the census takers in Bodie didn't always last long enough to finish their counts. In those 5 years, the Bodie morgue processed more bodies per person than any other settlement in California. And the town had 1 church and 65 saloons. It had a red light district that operated around the clock. It had a Chinatown, a Maiden Lane, a brewery, a slaughterhouse, a bank vault that was robbed so many times the lock was eventually welded shut rather than replaced. And it had a reputation that spread from San Francisco to Sacramento to the mining camps of Nevada for being the kind of place where a man could show up on Monday and be in the ground by Friday without anyone filing a report. Some of that reputation was exaggeration. Mining towns always cultivated a mythology of violence because violence attracted a particular kind of man. And those men spent money. But some of it, the parts that weren't written in the newspapers or the parts recorded only in coroner's logbooks and in the private letters of men who left Bodie quickly and never came back, some of it was worse than the reputation suggested. There were things that happened in Bodie that the official record buried not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient. Things that connected men of influence in ways those men could not afford to have connected. What we know today about Bodie is largely what was allowed to survive. Before we continue with the story of Bodie and what it actually cost to build, to break, and to bury, take a moment right now to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode, and while you're there, drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We read every single one, and then tonight we want to know who's out there in the dark with us. Now let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning that appears in the tourist brochures, but the real one. The one that started not with gold, but with a man named Waterman Bodie, a blizzard, and a decision that should never have been made. The eastern Sierra Nevada in the late 1850s was not a place that invited settlement. The mountains there rise abruptly from the Great Basin, and the terrain between them, the high desert valleys, the alkali flats, the volcanic tablelands, has a quality of hostility that early settlers often described not as dangerous but as indifferent. The land didn't want to kill you. It simply didn't care whether you lived or died. And in that indifference it killed many. And the elevation where Bodie would eventually sit 300 feet above sea level in the volcanic highlands east of the main Sierra Nevada crest meant that the seasons there were not the seasons that men from the eastern states or the European continent recognized. Winter arrived not in December, but in October. Sometimes in September, it didn't leave until May. Sometimes June, snow didn't come gently, it came sideways. Driven by winds that had crossed hundreds of miles of open desert before reaching the highlands with nothing left to stop them. The temperature in January could drop to 30 below zero Fahrenheit before accounting for the wind. There was no shelter in the landscape itself. No deep forests, no protective valleys. The terrain was high and flat and open, and whatever lived, or tried to live on it, did so in full exposure to whatever the sky decided to do. The Paiute people had lived in that region for centuries and understood its rhythms, where water could be found in summer, where game moved in winter. How to read the sky when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in an afternoon without warning. They called the volcanic highlands east of the Sierra by names that translated roughly to the place of difficult passage, and where the wind has no mercy. These were not poetic designations. They were practical ones. The Paiute moved through this country with the knowledge of people who had learned over many generations which parts of it could sustain life, and which could not, and on what schedule and at what cost. They knew, for instance, that the Highland Basin where Bodie would eventually stand was not a place to winter. They knew it because their ancestors had tried, and the ancestors had told their descendants what trying had cost. The men who arrived in the 1850s looking for gold did not speak Paiute, and most of them wouldn't have listened if they had. William Bodie, the man whose name would eventually, through misspelling and misremembering, become the name of one of California's most notorious towns, arrived in the Mono Lake region in the summer of 1859. He was a prospector from Poughkeepsie, New York, which is to say he was a man who had spent most of his adult life chasing something just over the next ridge. He had been in California since 1849 following the original rush, and by 1859 he was 41 years old, trail, worn and running low on both capital and patience. He had tried the rivers of the Mother Lode. He had tried the gravel bars of the American River and the Feather River and the Trinity. He had worked for wages in the hydraulic operations of the Northern Sierra and saved enough to strike out on his own again, and then lost those savings in a claim that yielded nothing and had started again. Men like Bodie were the majority of the California mining population by the late 1850s. Not the ones who had struck it rich in '49 and become legends, but the ones who had followed the legend and found only the diminishing returns of a rush that was already past its peak. They were patient in the way that men become patient when their other options are worse. He had partners, as most prospectors did. Men whose names the historical record treated with less care than it treated Bodie's, which is to say they were remembered incompletely and then forgotten. One was a man called Black Taylor, who may or may not have been born into slavery and freed before reaching California, depending on which account you trusted. Another was a French-Canadian whose name appears in some records as Doré and in others simply as the Frenchman. Both men were experienced in the rough mechanics of high-country prospecting. The placer panning in summer streams, the assessment of quartz outcroppings, the calculation of whether a promising sign justified the cost and labor of following it deeper. In late July of 1859, Bodie, Taylor, and Doré discovered placer gold in a ravine in the highlands about 80 miles north of Mono Lake. But the amount was not spectacular. Enough to confirm the presence of a vein, not enough to make anyone instantly rich. But in the exhausted arithmetic of late-stage California prospecting, it was enough to matter. The color they found in the pan was consistent. The rock formation suggested something below the surface that the surface samples couldn't fully reveal. It was, in the language of the trade, a showing, a reason to look further. Bodie recorded the claim. He sent word south. He began making plans. He did not survive to execute them. In November of 1859, Bodie and a companion named Esk, a younger man recently arrived from Ohio who had attached himself to the party in the summer and proven himself willing, if not particularly skilled, set out from their winter camp to retrieve supplies from a settlement in the valley below. They had put off the journey longer than they should have, waiting for a break in the weather that came briefly and then closed again before they reached safety. A storm came in from the north faster than either man anticipated. Esk survived by finding shelter in a stand of pinyon pines and building a fire from the deadfall around him, feeding it through the night while the wind brought the temperature down to levels that made breathing painful. Bodie did not. He was found the following spring, frozen less than half a mile from camp. He had made it nearly far enough. The camp was visible from where they found him, a fact that everyone who subsequently told the story noted, because it had the quality of things that are true and terrible, rather than simply terrible. He was buried near the discovery site in an unmarked grave. His partners misspelled his name in the claim documents. Whether by accident or carelessness, it had the same effect as intention. And the place became Bodie rather than Bodie. A slight and meaningless distortion that somehow felt appropriate for a town that would spend the next 20 years distorting everything it touched. For almost 2 decades after Bodie's death, The claims in the highlands changed hands multiple times without yielding anything significant. Small operations came and went. Men staked, dug, gave up, moved on. The land around the original discovery site remained largely unworked, its deeper veins untouched, sitting quietly beneath a few feet of volcanic soil, while the men who might have found it chose easier country. The winters drove most operators out. The cost of supplying an operation at that elevation on overland roads that were impassable for 5 months of the year made the margins on low-grade ore impossible. The Standard Mine Company, which had been incorporated in San Francisco in the early 1870s by men whose primary expertise was financial rather than geological, maintained a small crew on property, but without serious expectation of a return. It was the kind of investment that wealthy men made when they had money to lose, and a theory about what the rock might contain, understanding that most such theories proved wrong, and hoping this one would prove otherwise. Then in 1876, a mine shaft collapsed. The Standard Mine's operations had included, in the years before the collapse, a series of exploratory shafts driven into the hillside at various angles and depths, following what the company geological advisor, a man from San Francisco who visited twice a year and spent the rest of his time in an office, believed were the most promising structural indicators. One of those shafts, the eastern one, had been driven deeper than the others, deeper than the budget had originally authorized, because the foreman on site, a practical man named Gideon Frey from Ohio, who had 30 years of mining experience and no interest in the financial theories of men in San Francisco offices, had a feeling. The feeling was based on the color of the rock and the angle of the quartz intrusions, and the way the temperature dropped as you went deeper, which experienced miners used as an indicator of particular geological conditions that were associated in that part of the Sierra with high-grade ore. Frey's feeling turned out to be correct. The collapse of the eastern shaft in the autumn of 1876, a collapse that killed 2 men, a fact noted in the company's records and not dwelled upon, exposed in the rubble a vein of gold-bearing quartz that assayed at values that made the company's owners go pale when they read the report, not pale with fear, pale with the particular shock of sudden, almost incomprehensible wealth. The assay numbers were checked twice, because numbers like that were the kind of thing that happened in stories, not in the accounts of working mines in the California high desert. The numbers were confirmed. By the spring of 1877, the word was out, and the men began to arrive. In 1878, Bodie had a population of somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 people, and that number was growing by hundreds per month. The Standard Mine and the Bodie Mine were producing ore at rates that justified every superlative the San Francisco papers could manufacture. The Bodie Bank processed more gold dust in a single week that spring than some counties processed in a year. The town's commercial district on Main Street extended nearly half a mile with wooden storefronts pressed so tightly together that a fire at one end would have consumed everything before a man could run to the other. They had 2 fires in 1878. Neither of them was the last. The town itself had the quality of a place that had grown faster than its bones could support. Streets existed because men walked through the same mud often enough that the mud developed ruts, and the ruts became roads, and the roads attracted buildings on either side without any plan or logic. Town water arrived from a spring on the hillside through a pipe that froze solid every winter, so that between November and March, the town obtained its water from snow packed into barrels and melted near stoves. A process that was both laborious and ineffective, since the barrels were rarely clean, and the snow was rarely free of whatever the wind deposited in it during its crossing of the volcanic flats to the east. The sanitation arrangements were what a man who had lived in any established eastern city would have described, charitably, as provisional. In summer, the smell from the alleys behind the commercial district carried as far as the residential areas on the hill, and men who had grown up in places with sewers wrote home to their family, describing Bodie in terms that their families did not always believe, because the descriptions were too extreme to seem credible. The violence in Bodie during its peak years was not merely anecdotal, it was structural. The town had more than 60 establishments that sold alcohol. It had an opium trade, a gambling economy, and a floating population of men who had no stake in the community's future because they did not expect to remain long enough to have one. The justice system, such as it was, consisted of a sheriff whose jurisdiction was technically Mono County, but who was physically located 30 miles away in Bridgeport. A town marshal who was replaced 8 times in 4 years for reasons ranging from corruption to incompetence to death. And a justice of the peace who held court in a room above a saloon and whose rulings were occasionally enforced and occasionally not, depending largely on whether the defendant had friends who were better armed than the plaintiff's friends. To live in Bodie in 178 was to exist in a condition of continuous low-level alarm. The sounds of the town at night in the town had no real night because the saloons ran until dawn and the mills ran around the clock, their stamps pounding the ore in a rhythm that those who lived in Bodie long enough stopped hearing, the way people stop hearing a clock in a room they've occupied too long. Those sounds included, with a regularity that ceased to be remarkable, gunshots, sometimes distant, sometimes close, sometimes followed by shouting, by the sound of boots on wooden floors, by the particular quality of silence that followed sudden violence in a space full of men who were deciding whether to involve themselves or not. But the newspapers of the era, both local and in San Francisco, covered Bodie's violence with something that looked, at a certain distance, like horror, but that was actually closer to commercial enthusiasm. Stories of shootings sold papers, stories of robberies sold papers. The town had developed a reputation cultivated, exaggerated, but rooted in enough truth to maintain itself as the most dangerous settlement in California, a designation that attracted a particular kind of man and repelled the kind of family that might have stabilized it. One particular story, of a man named Patrick Fahey, which circulated through the California press in the summer of 1879, sold a great many papers and then, with unusual speed, stopped being mentioned at all. Patrick Fahey was 34 years old in 1879. He had come to Bodie from Virginia City, Nevada, where he had worked as a shift supervisor in the Comstock mines long enough to save a sum of money that he then lost in a speculation that he ever after refused to discuss in detail. He arrived in Bodie in the spring of 1878 with nothing but his tools, his experience, and a reputation among mining men as someone who understood geology with almost uncommon precision. The kind of man who could look at a rock face and describe what it was doing 50 feet beyond where the candle reached. He was, by the accounts of the few people who knew him in Bodie and later spoke about him, a quiet and private man. He did not frequent the saloons except occasionally when the cold was particular and the rooming house was insufficiently warm. He did not gamble. He attended no church, by which, in 1878, Bodie meant he attended the same institution as the majority of its residents. He was Irish, born in County Clare, raised in Philadelphia, shaped by the particular combination of Catholic sensibility and American practicality that characterized the generation of Irish American men who had come of age in the decade after the famine. He was a man who took notes. This was in itself unusual enough among mining men that his colleagues remarked on it. He carried a leather-bound notebook, small enough to fit in his coat pocket, thick enough to hold months of observations. And he used it constantly, recording the dimensions of rock faces, the angle of ore intrusions, the temperature and air quality at different depths of the shafts, the discrepancies he noticed between what he observed and what the official maps of the mine's workings depicted. The discrepancies were, at first, what geologists would call normal, minor variations between the idealized picture that a map represents and the actual irregular reality of rock under the earth. Rock does not follow lines, or does not conform to the angles at which engineers draw it. A certain amount of divergence between map and reality was expected and unremarkable. But the discrepancy that Fahey found in the late summer of 1879 was not the ordinary kind. He hired on at the Standard Mine, and within 6 months he was a shift foreman, which was significant advancement for a man without local connections. His supervisors, particularly the mine superintendent, a man named Calvin Pratt, who had come west from Pennsylvania with a degree in mining engineering from a school that no longer exists, and who managed the Standard's operations with a combination of technical competence and political sophistication that kept San Francisco's investors satisfied and Bodie's miners from recognized Fahey's practical knowledge and used it. Fahey knew where the ore was. He had a gift for it that Pratt, for all his formal education, could not replicate. The problem was that Fahey also knew other things. In the early autumn of 1879, Fahey wrote a letter, which has survived partially because a portion of it was entered into a county proceeding that was itself only partially preserved, in which he described what he had discovered in the lower levels of the Standard Mine's eastern shaft. He did not describe it clearly, which may have been deliberate caution, or may simply reflect the fact that he did not yet fully understand what he had found. But what he described, in the language of a man who chose his words with the deliberateness of someone who understood they might be read by hostile eyes, was evidence that ore samples from a particular section of the mine had been systematically underreported, not by accident, not by the ordinary slippage of record, keeping in a busy operation systematically, deliberately in a pattern that, if Fahey's interpretation was correct, had been running for at least 2 years and had diverted a significant and as yet uncalculated sum from the mine's public shareholders to persons unknown. The letter was addressed to a lawyer in San Francisco named Emmett Corcoran, who represented a consortium of investors who held shares in the Standard Mine. Corcoran received it. We know this because he later said so in a deposition, but he did not immediately act on it. And his explanation for the delay was that he wanted to verify the claims before bringing them to his clients. Patrick Fahey did not give him time to verify anything. On the night of October 14, 1879, Fahey was found dead in the alley behind the Occidental Hotel on Main Street. The alley was one of the narrow service passages that ran behind the commercial buildings, used during the day by delivery men and at night by men who preferred not to use the front entrance of establishments whose front entrances implied a kind of public commitment they were not prepared to make. It was dark. The town had no gas lighting in the alleys, and the light from the saloon windows on Main Street did not reach around the corners. The cold that night was the particular cold of an October in the eastern Sierra, which sits in the lungs differently than the cold of lower elevations. Drier, sharper, smelling of nothing, which is its own kind of wrongness. The official finding was that he had been shot during a robbery. His wallet and his watch were missing. And while the town marshal at the time, a man named Rufus Strand, opened an inquiry, that inquiry produced no arrests and was formally closed within 3 weeks. The San Francisco papers ran the story for 2 days, then they ran nothing. What they did not run, what no paper ran at the time, although several journalists later claimed to have been aware of it, was the fact that Patrick Fahey had not been carrying his wallet that night. His landlady, a widow named Agnes Corrigan, who ran the rooming house on Fuller Street where Fahey had boarded for 14 months, told the inquest that Fahey had left his wallet in his room that evening because he had told her he was only walking to the assay office and back. She had seen him go. She had noted, as landladies note things about the men in their care, that he had seemed preoccupied, not frightened, she said, but the way a man seems when he is carrying something in his mind that is too large to set down. He carried nothing but his notebook, a small leather-bound notebook that he used for his geological observations and that, unlike the wallet and the watch, was never found. The notebook, that is the detail that keeps appearing in the edges of this story, mentioned and then abandoned, the way a name keeps surfacing in a document that was not supposed to contain it. Corrigan told the inquest about the notebook. The inquest noted her testimony and moved on. Corcoran, the San Francisco lawyer, mentioned it in his deposition and then clarified, when pressed, that he had never seen its contents and could not speak to its significance. A mine worker named Thomas Healy, who had been Fahey's closest associate at the Standard and who had been present at the eastern shaft the day Fahey made his discovery, testified before the same inquest that he too had seen Fahey take notes in that notebook on the day in question. Healy left Bodie 3 months after the inquest. He went to Oregon, and according to a letter he sent Corrigan, and after that the record of Thomas Healy ends. The notebook was never found, the inquiry was closed, the Standard Mine continued operating. And in the spring of 1880, Calvin Pratt, the mine superintendent Fahey's superior, the man with the engineering degree, purchased in cash a substantial house in San Francisco's Nob Hill neighborhood. The purchase price was recorded in the public property records. It was a number that did not align easily with a superintendent's salary, even a generous one. No one asked him about it publicly. No one seems to have asked him about it at all. The years between 1880 and 1882 were Bodie's apex. The Standard Mine alone produced millions in gold during those 2 years, and the town that had grown around it reached what contemporaries called its fullest and most terrible flower, a phrase used by a Methodist minister named Elias Drummond, who arrived in Bodie in the summer of 1880 to establish a congregation and spent most of the next year writing letters home to his bishop that grew progressively more desperate in tone. Drummond's letters have survived in their entirety in the archives of the Methodist Episcopal Church. They constitute, inadvertently, one of the most vivid first-person accounts of Bodie at its peak, not because Drummond was a particularly skilled observer, but because he was a man who was genuinely shocked by what he saw and had not yet learned to moderate his shock for an audience. He described the streets at night as a continuous corridor of noise and ruin, in which the light from 60 doorways makes a kind of counterfeit noon, and men pass through it in states of intoxication, so profound that they appear to be navigating not a street, but some internal landscape of which the rest of us can have no conception. He described the cemetery on the hill above town, Boot Hill, though he refused to use that name, as filling at a rate that troubled him not only morally but practically. There was, he wrote in October of 1880, beginning to be a problem of space. He was not wrong. The Bodie Cemetery records, which are more complete than most of the town's surviving documents, list 273 burials between 1877 and 1882. Of those, 61 were attributed to gunshot wounds, of which 49 were ruled homicides and 12 were classified as accidents. Another 37 were attributed to mining accidents. 18 were attributed to freezing, which in the context of the era meant any death resulting from exposure to the extreme winter conditions, temperatures that regularly fell below zero and stayed there, winds that came down off the mountains at speeds that blew men off their horses. 23 were attributed to illness, a category that covered everything from pneumonia to the various symptoms that in the 1880s traveled under the name of fever, without further specification, and the remaining, a category that the record keeper simply labeled cause undetermined, numbered 41. 41 people buried in Bodie between 1877 and 1882, whose cause of death was listed as undetermined and lost in a town where the coroner was also the town dentist and the town's most active gambling parlor operator, and where the coroner's official seal appears on documents that sometimes contradict each other in their descriptions of the same event. Undetermined could mean many things. It could mean what it said. It could mean the death had been determined, but the determination was inconvenient. It could mean that no one with authority had looked carefully enough to form an opinion. Among the 41 was a man named Dario Lucchetti. Lucchetti was Italian, born in the Piedmont region, arrived in California in 1875, spent 2 years working in hydraulic mining operations in the northern Sierra, before coming south to Bodie in 1877. He was a laborer, not a skilled miner, which meant he did the physical work of breaking and hauling rock, rather than the technical work of assessing and directing it. He worked for the Bodie mine, not the Standard, and his employment records there are among the more complete surviving documents from the period. The Bodie mine kept better books than its competitor for reasons that likely had as much to do with legal caution as with administrative virtue. Lucchetti appears in those records as a reliable and uncomplaining worker who received periodic wage increases and never filed a grievance. He also appears, and this is where his story becomes less ordinary, in the private account book of a man named Samuel Obergfell, a merchant who operated a dry goods store on King Street and who maintained, in addition to his business ledger, a second, smaller notebook in which he recorded personal debts, favors, and what he called, in his ornate mid-century German script, matters of weight. Obergfell's second notebook was discovered in 1923 in the back room of a building in Bridgeport, California, by a woman who was clearing out property that had belonged to her deceased uncle. She gave it to a local historian who transcribed portions of it before the original was lost. And those transcriptions are held today in the collection of the Eastern California Museum in Independence. In September of 1881, Obergfell's notebook records a conversation with Lucchetti. The record is brief. Obergfell was not a man who wrote at length about things he found uncomfortable, but its contents are specific. Lucchetti had told him something about the Bodie mine's lower tunnels, and something that Obergfell describes only as the matter concerning the Chinese workers and the passage they were made to use. The Bodie mine, like many California mining operations of the period, employed a significant number of Chinese laborers. The Chinese workers in Bodie occupied a separate neighborhood, the Chinatown, on the town's southeastern edge, and within the mine they were assigned to the most physically dangerous work, the tunnels with the worst air, the lowest ceilings, the most unstable walls. This was not unusual for the era, and it was not illegal under California law at the time, though several labor organizations had been arguing for years that it should be. What Lucchetti had told Obergfell, apparently, was something more specific than the general conditions of Chinese labor in the Bodie mine. He had told him about a particular passage, a particular use of a particular passage. And whatever that use was, it had troubled Lucchetti enough that he had told Obergfell, and it had troubled Obergfell enough that he had written it down in his private notebook under the heading, Matters of Weight, and then had evidently done nothing about it, because the next entry in the notebook concerning Lucchetti simply records his death. Dario Lucchetti was found dead on the morning of March 3, 1882, at the bottom of a shaft in the Bodie mine's eastern section. The shaft was one he was not assigned to work. The foreman's report states that he must have wandered into the area by accident in the pre-dawn darkness. The shift began before sunrise in winter and fallen. The depth of the shaft was sufficient to ensure that the fall itself was the cause of death. The coroner's determination was accidental death. It was recorded as undetermined in the cemetery records, which may indicate a clerical error or may indicate something else, but the discrepancy was never investigated. Obergfell noted it in his private book. He wrote, "Lucchetti is dead. The matter he described is now, I think, beyond my ability to pursue. I will say no more of it here. He never did." The decline of Bodie did not happen all at once. It happened the way all such declines happen, in phases, each of which felt, to the people living through it, like a temporary setback rather than the beginning of an end. The ore grades at the Standard and the Bodie mines began dropping in 1882, not precipitously but gradually, the way a tide goes out, so slowly that you don't notice it's gone until you're standing in mud. The mill runs that had been producing $20 of gold per ton dropped to 15, then to 12, then to numbers that made the accountants in San Francisco begin to ask questions that the men in Bodie did not want to answer. By 1883, the population had dropped by half. By 1885, it had dropped by half again. The saloons began closing, not all at once, but one by one, the ones with the highest rents going first, the ones on the edges going next. The Chinese laborers, who had no financial stake in the town and no reason to stay once the work dried up, left in organized groups for San Francisco and Sacramento. The red light district contracted to a single street and then to a handful of houses that operated quietly and without ceremony. The Bank of Bodie closed in 1884, taking with it whatever records it had maintained about the financial movements of the mine companies and their officers. Calvin Pratt, the Standard Mine superintendent, had already been gone for 2 years by then. He had resigned in the fall of 1882, citing personal considerations, and had returned to his Nob Hill house in San Francisco, where he lived comfortably for the rest of his long life. He gave an interview to the San Francisco Chronicle in 1891 on the occasion of his appointment to the board of a new Nevada mining concern, in which he described his years in Bodie as formative and challenging in ways that built character. The interviewer asked him about the town's violence. He said it had been exaggerated. The interviewer asked him about the Standard Mine's production records. He said they had been exemplary. The interviewer did not ask about Patrick Fahey. The interview was published on a Sunday. It was, by all accounts, well received. Emmett Drummond, the Methodist minister, left Bodie in the spring of 1883. He went to a congregation in Stockton and then to one in Sacramento. And in his final years of active ministry, he gave several lectures on the subject of mining town morality that were notable for what they omitted. He spoke at length about the drinking, the gambling, the violence in abstract terms. He never mentioned Patrick Fahey. He never mentioned Dario Lucchetti. He never mentioned the specific content of the conversations he had recorded in his own private correspondence, which he appears to have burned before his death in 1909. Agnes Corrigan, Fahey's landlady, stayed in Bodie longer than most. She converted her rooming house into a boarding house and then, as the population shrank, into a private residence. She is listed in the 1890 census as one of fewer than 300 people still resident in Bodie. She died there in 1897, in a town that had by then shrunk to a skeleton. A few dozen holdouts, a mine or two still producing fitfully, the buildings already beginning to show what would become their characteristic quality of preserved collapse. She left upon her death a small collection of personal effects and a letter that was addressed to no one and sealed with wax. The letter was found among her things by the man who had been hired to clear the property, a drifter named Cole Renner, who had arrived in Bodie looking for winter work and stayed 6 months. Renner could read, which placed him in a minority among the men doing that kind of labor in that period. And he read the letter before deciding what to do with it. What he did with it, ultimately, was give it to a woman in Bridgeport named Ida Sargent, who was the wife of the Mono County recorder and who had taken an interest in collecting documents from the declining settlements of the region. Sargent held the letter for many years and showed it to several people without making its contents widely known. After her death, it passed to her daughter, and after the daughter's death, to a historical collection. But which collection is a matter of some confusion, because the letter appears in 2 separate inventories from the early 20th century, and in neither inventory after 1931. The contents of the letter, as described by the people who read it before it disappeared, were as follows. Agnes Corrigan wrote that in the weeks before Patrick Fahey's death, he had told her something that she had not repeated at the inquest because she was afraid, and that she was writing it down now because she was old and there was no one left to be afraid of. Fahey, she wrote, had found in the lower levels of the Standard Mine's eastern shaft a secondary passage unmarked, not appearing on any official map of the mine's workings, that connected to a section of the mine's infrastructure that was designated on internal company documents as an ore processing auxiliary. He had followed this passage and had discovered that the auxiliary was not an ore processing facility at all, but a storage space, a large and reinforced chamber, in which there was machinery that Fahey, with his extensive knowledge of mining operations, identified as equipment for the systematic segregation and diversion of high-grade ore before it reached the mill. In plain terms, a skimming operation. High-grade ore was being pulled from the rock before it was weighed and recorded, diverted through the secondary passage, processed separately, and its value recorded nowhere in the company. Official books. The gold it produced went somewhere. The Standard Mine shareholders, many of them ordinary investors in San Francisco who had bought shares on the public exchange, never saw it. Fahey had found this. He had measured it, estimated its scale, recorded his findings in his notebook. He had written to Corcoran, the lawyer, and then, 3 weeks later, he had been shot in an alley and the notebook had never been found. Corrigan did not name the men she believed responsible. She said only that Fahey had told her the operation could not have been maintained without the knowledge and cooperation of several people, whose names he had not given her because he did not want her in danger. She said that she had lived the 17 years since his death with the weight of that knowledge, and that she was tired of carrying it. The letter ended. "I do not know if this will reach anyone who will do something with it. I suspect it will not. Things like this have a way of becoming old news before they become no news, but I have written it. That is the only thing left that I could do. The fire of 1892 destroyed most of what remained of Bodie's commercial district. It started in a building on Green Street in the early morning hours of a July day, in conditions of low humidity and high wind that made it effectively unstoppable once it reached the adjacent structures. 63 buildings burned. The town's population at that point was small enough that everyone who wanted to watch did so from a safe distance, and no one died, which was a different kind of miracle than the miracles Bodie had been accustomed to in its prime. What burned in 1892 included the office of the Bodie Free Press, which had been the town's newspaper during the peak years and had, in the course of its publication, accumulated a library of back issues, correspondence, and unpublished materials. All of it was gone by morning. The editor at the time, an elderly man named Frank Overton, who had been running the paper for 15 years on the strength of local inertia and personal stubbornness, told the Bridgeport Chronicle that he had lost, among other things, a file of documents he had been intending to do something with. He did not specify what the documents were. He was asked, and he said only that they were things that had been sent to me over the years by people who wanted something done, and then thought better of wanting it. He was 71 years old. He died the following winter. Whatever he had been intending to do with those documents went with him. The fire of 1892 is documented. The fire of 1932, which destroyed a second substantial portion of the town,